that evening, Hannibal's cavalry officer Maharbal implored him to take advantage of the victory. Maharbal offered to take the cavalry and race ahead to attack the gates of Rome itself. But Hannibal, surveying his injured troops, decided against it, saying, "I commend your zeal, but I need time to weigh the plan which you propose."
Maharbal said in disgust, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to exploit it." And Livy adds, that day's delay is generally agreed to have been the salvation of the Empire of Rome.
The Romans had put their best and biggest ever army up against the Carthaginians, and they had still lost, and they'd lost in a terrible fashion. By all the unwritten rules of warfare in this era, the Romans were defeated. They were expected to surrender.
Confident of his success, Hannibal sent emissaries to Rome to offer terms for surrender and to collect ransom for his hostages. The Roman response would surprise him completely. In just 2 years, the Romans had lost 3 major battles and more than 100,000 men at the hands of Hannibal. Following the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's youngest brother Mago returned home, where he offered Carthaginian leaders an impressive display of his brother's victories.
Mago has these chests carried into the Carthaginian Senate, and they contain the rings that the Roman aristocracy wore. Mago has these things poured out in great mounds on the floor just to show how many Romans they've killed.
Back in Italy, Hannibal fully expected the Romans to surrender. He dispatched an emissary and 10 hostages to Rome to negotiate terms for peace.
He didn't want to shatter Rome and destroy it altogether. What he wanted to do was a fairly standard thing, the way most people in the world thought of warfare. And that was fight to the point where one side admitted that it had been beaten and then accepted a treaty by which it conceded various things that the victor wanted. The Romans just did not think that way. Every Roman war was taken personally.
The Romans not only refused to surrender, they forbade Roman citizens to pay ransom for their family members.
They refuse to accept that they have been defeated by all the acknowledged rules of war. It could be patriotism, it could be sheer bloody-mindedness that they do this, but they carry on.
Hannibal was probably shocked when his emissaries came back empty-handed. His entire strategy was based on the notion that after a major victory on his part, the Romans would stop.
Instead, the Romans raised a new army, 25 legions of 4,000 men each. At the same time, the Romans realized it had been a mistake to abandon the delaying tactics of Fabius. They again changed strategy and resumed their war of attrition.
Hannibal needed victories in the battlefield if the Roman allies were to join him. The Romans simply refused to face him. They decided to pin him down. Quintus Fabius Maximus, known to the Romans as the Delayer, took command of the Roman armies. His strategy, which he'd used for a short period before Cannae, became effectively the official Roman policy. Hannibal wouldn't be fought.
But changes in strategy weren't enough in the panic after Cannae. The Romans were convinced that they had lost the favor of their gods. They must make amends.
The Romans sought to make things right with the universe by doing whatever it took to make things right with the gods again. 2 Vestals were accused of unchastity, and it was thought that this had somehow added to the failure at Cannae. One of the Vestals was buried alive, as was the tradition for dealing with an unchaste virgin. The other one had conveniently committed suicide. In the wake of the loss of the Vestals, we have a very unusual ritual being performed by the Romans. The sacrifice of 4 people by being buried alive to reestablish a good relationship with the gods.
Hannibal continued his rampage through southern Italy. Some towns fell to the sword, others simply changed their allegiance from Rome to Carthage. His biggest prize was Capua, the second largest city in Italy. Hannibal's grand plan to isolate Rome appeared to be working. By 212 BC, he controlled much of southern Italy. But not all Italians viewed the Carthaginians as liberators. Many saw them as murderous barbarians. Those steadfast allies refused to abandon their allegiance to Rome, fearing retribution if Hannibal were ever defeated.
What Hannibal faced in the wake of his great victory at Cannae was the fact that his strategy was misconceived. Even though states in the south of Italy would begin to rebel against Rome, the core of Roman power in northern and central Italy would remain intact. He had simply not anticipated this. He had misunderstood what the relationship was between Rome and its allies. His allies were not going to desert, so no matter what he did in Italy, it would not be enough.
Those Roman allies whom Hannibal had won over were now demanding he protect them from the wrath of the vengeful Roman. He would now be forced to fight a defensive war.
All of these communities that have defected to Hannibal, supplied him with soldiers, then start crying out to Hannibal, it's because of you and because of what we've done, the Romans are coming for us. So Hannibal has to rush from one crisis to another.
A critical turning point came in 211 BC when the Romans laid siege to Capua. Unable to lure the Romans into an open battle, Hannibal was powerless to break the siege. He responded with a breathtaking gamble. Hoping to draw the Romans away from Capua, he marched his army to the gates of Rome. The Greek historian Polybius later recounted the horror of that day. When the arrival of his army was reported, a wave of fear and panic swept through the city, for never before had Hannibal approached so close to the capital. The men therefore immediately manned the walls and occupied the commanding positions outside the city, while the women made the rounds of the temples and besought the gods to protect them, sweeping the pavements of the shrines with their hair, as is their custom at moments when extreme peril threatens the country. Hannibal's arrival at the gates caused great alarm, but it was 5 years too late. In the time since the Roman defeat at Cannae, the Republic had recovered both in spirit and strength, leaving Hannibal in a purgatory of sorts. The Roman army could not forcibly remove him from the outskirts of the city, yet he lacked the equipment and manpower to lay siege to Rome. In a show of disdain for Hannibal, the Roman Senate auctioned off the very land on which the Carthaginian army was camped, at full price. Hannibal retreated to the southeast. Over the next several years, the Carthaginians fought and won small skirmishes against the Romans, but only seized one port city on the opposite side of Italy from Spain. For all intents and purposes, Hannibal was cut off from his homeland and much-needed reinforcements. Hannibal had become a chronic problem for the Romans, but a manageable one.
Whilst the Romans don't beat him, successively over the years they do pen him more and more tightly into an increasingly small corner of Italy.
With Hannibal bogged down in Italy, the Romans expanded their battle against Carthage to new theaters throughout the Mediterranean.
Through having these series of proxy wars, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, southern Gaul, Italy, Illyria, the war starts to look as though it's kind of a first world war. It's taking place everywhere in the Mediterranean. It will eventually take place in Africa as well.
Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal fought the Romans in Spain, and his army was destroyed. With the Barcid stronghold now in the hands of the enemy, he assembled a small army and made his own crossing of the Alps. Hasdrubal arrived in northern Italy in early 207 BC and hoped to soon meet up with his brother. But the Roman army was waiting for him.
Hasdrubal's force is very quickly cornered by far superior Roman forces and is simply destroyed. It's cut to pieces in a very short time. Now, Hannibal only finds out that his brother was in Italy at all when the Romans, having beheaded his brother, throw the severed head over the rampart of his camp in southern Italy.
I think Hannibal was probably shocked by the treatment of his brother's corpse, but it must have brought it home to him that he had no hope of winning. There was no Carthaginian armies to come from Spain. There was certainly no Carthaginian army to come from Carthage. He had to win this war, or at least survive in this war, purely with the troops he then had. It was quite clear that wasn't going to be enough.
In 204 BC, Hannibal received an urgent message from Carthage. His home city was under attack by the Romans. Hannibal departed Italy for North Africa to fight a battle that would decide the fate of Carthage and the entire Western world. By 206 BC, Rome finally found a commander who would be a worthy opponent to Hannibal, Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger. No one understood the intricacies of Hannibal's tactics better than Scipio.
The younger Scipio was present at the Battle of the Ticinus, obviously, because he was there to save his father. And he possibly was also at the Battle of the Trebia River, so he saw Hannibal's tactics in action there as well. And then, of course, he was at the Battle of Cannae. So at least in 3 instances, Scipio had a very good look at what Hannibal was doing. And he obviously must have learned something from all this.
A year after his father and uncle were killed leading the Roman armies in Spain in 211 BC, the 25-year-old Scipio was chosen to succeed them. The young general immediately set to work revamping the Roman army.
Roman tactics prior to that have been very straightforward. They've been little more than attack, pause, allow fresh troops to replace the initial troops, and then attack again. Scipio's not doing that. Scipio's maneuvering very carefully. And you can actually trace this tactical development from Hannibal's father through Hannibal to Scipio himself.
Over the next 5 years, while Hannibal was pinned down in southern Italy, Scipio conquered all of Spain for Rome.
What Scipio had done was really to wage the war in Spain that Hannibal had hoped that he was going to wage in Italy.
Scipio returned to Rome in 206 BC as a conquering hero. He was elected consul the next year and was granted rule over the island of Sicily. There, he was reunited with veterans he'd fought with at Cannae.
After Cannae, the troops that had survived the battle and had escaped were seen as cowards. And the punishment for fleeing, the punishment for surviving the battle, was to be basically sent on active duty forever. They were sent to Sicily and there to stay for the duration of the war. When Scipio arrives in Sicily, he's ready to lead them to Africa in what will be an opportunity to have their revenge for the defeat at the hands of Hannibal over a dozen years earlier at Cannae.
In the early summer of 204 BC, Scipio and an army of 17,000 men set sail for North Africa.
Scipio lands and demonstrates just how much the Romans have learned since the beginning of the war, how much more effective they are as an army, and how much more skillful their commanders like Scipio are.
Adding to the Carthaginians' worries, the Romans had allied themselves with the feared Numidian cavalry, who'd once been a key component of Hannibal's army. Scipio easily defeated the Carthaginian forces in North Africa. The Carthaginians were forced to petition for peace. At the same time, they sent a messenger to Hannibal, calling him back to defend his homeland. Seldom has any exile left his native land with so heavy a heart as Hannibal's, wrote the Roman historian Livy. Upon departing Italy, a tearful Hannibal was said to have railed against his political rivals in Carthage. For years past,